Next, we have Dr. Ann Gormley coming up to speak about volunteer leadership. I know it's volunteerism on a different level. Um, we kind of crossed paths. You finished in 1993, and I showed up in 1993. So, welcome. She's a professor of surgery at Dartmouth College and a trustee of the American Board of Urology. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Mady. It's really nice to be back in Ann Arbor. It's been quite a while since I've been back, so it's wonderful to be here. Thanks also to Ganesh. So when I was asked to do this, I thought, well, what do I teach the people in Michigan? You know, if I think of my colleagues here in Michigan, I thought I'm really not sure there's much I can talk to them about. But this is a talk that I've given in other forms, and I thought maybe, particularly for the residents and the younger people who are here, hopefully I can teach you something. So I have multiple disclosures of various committees that I've been involved in that I'll be talking about today. I currently am a contract management board person for the NIH, NIDDK, and I'm an ABU trustee. So what I'm going to cover today is why volunteer leadership matters, why people should consider volunteering as a leader, how does one start, why should people want to do this, how can you position yourself for a leadership position in volunteering? And then I'm going to take a bit of a segue and talk about the role of the sections and the AUA, because I think a lot of people don't really understand that. I think when one is going to be a volunteer leader, you have to think about the timing. You may need to learn to lead. And then lastly, we'll talk about how people can get involved. And as I talk about all this, I'll give some examples of what I've done sort of in my volunteer career. So leadership matters because organized urology relies on physician leaders. So if one thinks about the sort of alphabet soup of urology organizations, they're all primarily run by volunteers. And if we don't do it, who will? So I think that's sort of the number one reason to do it. I will not be talking about career leaders like hospital chairs, or hospital leaders, executives, and chairs. And Gary really covered that very well, so I have nothing to add to that. But I'm going to talk about volunteer leaders. And this can be, I think, increasingly part of one's career path. And I will say that many chairs also do a lot of volunteer leadership. So you can do this at the local level, at your university or hospital system. You can do it as part of the AUA section or the AUA, and you can do it in any of the specialty societies that we all belong to. Why do people volunteer? Well, for many of us, it's ingrained. So if I think of my childhood, both of my parents were very active volunteers. My mother was a nurse who never worked in my life as a nurse, but she was a very busy homemaker who many of her volunteer activities revolved around the things that my siblings and I did. But she also had her own interests, and she bred and trained dogs and went on to serve as a board member of the Canadian Kennel Club. My dad was a family doctor, and despite his very busy practice, he was very involved in our church. He was involved in civic politics, and he held leadership positions in both the provincial and the Canadian Medical Association. And I remember a conversation one night at dinner when my younger sister said, "What is it about Gormleys that we always have to be the boss of things?" And this, following a very spirited discussion, I left the dinner table that night realizing that the reason to get involved and to be really active is to help to make an organization better. But as I've been a volunteer leader, I've realized that sometimes you're not going to make it better, but you have to work to maintain an already highly functioning organization. So why should we volunteer when there are other things that we can do to be paid? Well, volunteering takes time and commitment, but it allows you to try things out, and I think it's less risky. I think if somebody decides that they're going to be a chair of urology, they're really making a massive commitment. But you can get into a volunteer leadership commitment, and you can decide, you know, this really isn't for me, and you haven't really lost a lot. And a lot of times the organization hasn't lost very much. It also allows you to get your foot in the door. It's an opportunity to be noticed, and it can be a stepping stone to a paid position. So one starts by putting your hand up. And if you ask my husband, he would say, I put my hand up too many times. But I think increasingly, I've learned to be thoughtful about what I say yes to. So you have to pick something that you really are interested in. You have to ask yourself, can you provide what this group needs? And if you're looking at this as part of your career, you have to say, is this an opportunity that will help me? And I often hear from women in urology that they feel that they're often relegated to be the medical student coordinator. Well, I was a medical student coordinator, but I made sure that it was to my advantage. And my chairman knew from the day that I took that I was doing that position because I wanted to be a program director one day. So you can use those kinds of positions as leverage. So there are plenty of opportunities to volunteer. This is from the AUA website. There's more than 500 people volunteer for the AUA on 50 different councils, committees, and work groups. The current application for committees just ended, but it reopens every summer. There are other opportunities outside of the AUA with our various societies. You can also be a volunteer for regulatory agencies such as the ACGME, which is the head of the Residency Review Committee. The ABMS is often looking for volunteers, and much of the work that many of us do for the NIH is as a volunteer. There are opportunities in publishing, both as assistant and associate editors. Editors are generally paid. And then there's educational opportunities, things like course participants and course directors. And obviously there's a lot of international societies that we can also be involved with. So if you want to volunteer as a leader, you have to be doing it for the right reasons. And I believe that the reasons are that you have a desire to be more involved and you're passionate about what the organization does. I think if you want to be a volunteer leader because you think of yourself as being an agent of change, you may be disappointed. That's not to say you can't do that, but there are some organizations that are pretty difficult to change. And I think the last and the worst reason that anybody should want to be a volunteer leader is that they think they're owed it. In my experience, people who think they're owed it tend not to do a very good job of it. And I think really because their heart's not in it for the right reasons. So I sought out leadership positions because I was interested in things. I also thought that they were very educational. It's a really good way to understand how organizations work. And many of my volunteer efforts led to new interests and opportunities. So being in SUFU got me very interested in the whole fellowship process and the accreditation process, which then made me apply to be on the RRC. Through that, I was then asked to be on the Committee of Certification for the American Board of Medical Specialties. And finally, it got me interested in being on the ABU. So leadership positions in volunteer groups also help us develop leadership skills. And for me, it's been an antidote to burnout. It gives me a real sense of self-worth at the end of the day. And I'm always excited to go home and work on something in the evening or on the weekend if it means that I don't have to actually open the medical record and look at charts. So I've talked about the sort of the educational reasons to do volunteer leadership. It's also rewarding in another sense, and that is you get a tremendous ability to network. It's opportunities to meet people and to make a difference, and also sometimes to make a change. But one has to realize it is more work, it takes time, and you often have to travel. And you need support at work. I've been at Dartmouth now for 31 years, and I've had 3 chairmen. Every one of my chairmen has been very supportive about what I do for organized urology, and they have never held it against me. And I think if you don't have that sort of support, it's really difficult to do. You also need to have support at home. And despite the fact that Richard sometimes complains I'm away a little too often, he is very supportive of what I do. And interestingly, since he's retired, he's taken on increasing volunteer responsibilities as well. So my personal leadership journey, like I said, I've always been one to put my hand up. In med school, I volunteered for the undergraduate medical education committee, which also was involved with promotions. And that really gave me a real interest in medical education in terms of things like professionalism, academic problems, and how we remediate people. In residency, I volunteered to serve on the GME, and through that, I was involved in the Professional Association of Interns and Residents in 2 different provinces and then nationally. That was one of the times that I got into real trouble for my volunteer work. And the trouble that I got into was both in Newfoundland and in Alberta. People said to me, "You're spending too much time doing this, and it's interfering with your residency." And I said, I will work to make that not happen, but it's really important that we're at the table. So these organizations were very powerful, and residents were primarily represented by psychiatry, emergency medicine, and pediatric residencies. And at one point in Alberta, they were talking about a 40-hour work week. And I said, if there isn't a surgeon there to say that we can't learn to be a resident working 40 hours a week, I said, we're going to lose out. And that actually gave them an appreciation for what we were doing. So in the end, it did work to my advantage. One of my mentors, of my many mentors, many of whom are here at Michigan, but one of my mentors in Edmonton, David Mader, who was also a volunteer leadership and an executive, gave me a really good piece of advice. He said, when you start your practice, find a committee you're interested in and ask how you can get involved. And his caveat to that was, if you don't find something, they'll assign you something. And he said, the kiss of death is to be assigned to sit on the medical records committee. Now, I don't even think a medical records committee exists anymore, but I think that was really good advice from David. So when I got to Dartmouth, as I said earlier, I said, okay, I'll advise the medical students. And from there, I became the program director, which is a paid position. I, at one point, sat on our institutional animal care and use committee. And I remember talking to John Heaney, my chairman, about whether or not I should take it. And I said, what is this actually going to do for me and the section? And one of the things that we talked about, it was a real eye-opener to what research was being done in the institution. And it became really helpful for me in advising our residents as to what they could be doing research in. I sat on the compensation committee for a long time, and what that really helped me identify was that I did not want to be a chairman, because chairmen at our place don't have much power in terms of things like compensation. And that was sort of an eye-opening thing that, even though I thought at one point I wanted to be a chairman, that made me realize that I did not want to be a chairman at Dartmouth. And then most recently, I've been on the promotions committee. So when you're planning your leadership pursuits, you have to say, what are your goals and what do you need to get there? One regret I have is that I never did any leadership courses formally because I felt I was too busy and I didn't think I had the time to do it. And now I tell people all the time, take the time to do it. But if you are going to do a course, you have to decide who will pay for it, where's the time going to come from, and when you look at the organization that you're hoping to join, learn what it takes. How many hours is it? Sometimes they're not always honest about it. I think back to the Residency Review Committee and being told that I would attend 3 meetings a year. I went to 3 different meetings in Chicago about RRC things before I ever attended an RRC meeting. So you could sort of double some of those committees by 2. It's really helpful to know the governance of the organization that you're getting involved in. And I like to say, read the bylaws. Having been on a number of bylaw committees, I think nobody reads the bylaws. But if you really want to know how an organization works, read the bylaws. And again, the support is important. So just to make a segue to talk about the role of the sections in the AUA, people in urology, particularly in the subspecialties, often gripe that they're not well represented. Well, the way to get well represented is work through your section. The sections play a major role in the nominating process for many things at the AUA, including the leadership program, a variety of committees, the section reps to the board of directors, and also the president. So the sections nominate and the AUA appoints. A number of positions and rotations are very dependent on the population of the section, so they really have proportional representation. Then there are other positions, things like the secretary, the treasurer, and the chairs of the major committees. Those are self-nominated, and then they're chosen by the board. So if I look at my work in our New England section, I started off, like most people do, as a New Hampshire rep. In total, I served on the board for 16 years, then in an executive position. And that was, I had an opportunity to put my name in as secretary, and from there you then rise eventually to the president. I had just finished as the president when we were up to choose a new representative to the board of directors of the AUA, so I did run for that, and I felt my timing was really sort of good at that time, and I then had the pleasure of doing that and really learned a lot being on the AUA board. Looking at subspecialties, I had an almost equally long term that sort of paralleled that on SUFU. So I was a member at large twice on SUFU, which you can no longer do. And SUFU has changed their bylaws a lot since I was very involved with it. And they no longer have as long terms, which is good because, again, it was sort of a very long time on SUFU, first as secretary and then eventually as the president and then the president of the foundation. So when you're positioning yourself for a leadership role, you have to say, is the timing right? If I look at things that I had to do to take some of those leadership positions, in our New England section, they had a very strict conflict of interest rule. They've actually waived that at the moment, but I actually had to stop all speaker bureau work a year prior to letting my name stand. Understanding the governance is important because you have to know who you have to talk to get the position. So in our section, to be the section secretary, you have to be nominated by the nominating committee. That's the 3 past presidents and the secretary. So I made sure I spoke to each of the past presidents, told them why I wanted the job and what I thought I could do with it. Other things, like I said, are elected. When you're looking at these positions, you also have to consider your competition. And you have to say, are these people that you actually want to run against? So there's been some positions in our section where 2 of my mentors had their names in for it. And I thought, I don't want to run against either of those people. So I didn't run for that particular position. So always sort of consider that. And again, is the time right? Do you have support? And what do you have to give up to do the job? So for some, getting back to the competition piece, there's some jobs that you know who the competition is. There are other jobs that you don't have a clue who your competition is going to be. But you always sort of have to think of what will happen if you split the vote. So be mindful of that. And if you fail to get a position, it may not be anything about you as a person. It's often that organizations are looking for variety in where people come geographically, subspecialty representation, and diversity. So if you fail and you're still interested, try it again. So just a word about being an AUA board member. That, I think, was a real learning experience for me. I think having been on the section secretaries committee was really valuable. And AUA does have a very excellent onboarding process. One of the things that I learned about the AUA, though, is how the board changes every year. So there's a new president and probably 2 new board members. And really the tenor of the board can do a 180 flip within 1 year. And I also knew, but it was really hit home many times, is that the AUA is a very complex organization and it caters to a vast array of interests. And at times I felt like we didn't get enough done because we were too busy trying to cater to all those interests. So when you're planning, know the bylaws. How do people ascend? What are the expectations? How long is the term? And can you do it? There are leadership programs that you can take. The AUA has a leadership program aimed at people 15 years or less out of training. And again, these nominations come from the section. This is a very popular program. And because of this, the AUA has started their Institute for Leadership in Business. The American College of Surgeons has a very good leadership program. Academic institutions also have them. Find a leadership mentor. So Ed McGuire is my greatest mentor, and I always saw Ed as also a volunteer leader as well, and I got lots of advice from him along the way as I was putting my name in for various things. Sometimes you need to look outside the specialty, and sometimes even look at a non-physician in terms of getting mentored for these sorts of positions. So why should we seek out volunteer leadership? We can impact the future of our specialty and subspecialty. We have all these well-functioning urologist-led organizations, and we'd like to maintain those. And increasingly, for those of us in academics, leadership is now considered to be part of engagement. And many schools are now, fortunately, using it in promotion. So I think for volunteer leadership, the future is really bright. Residents and young urologists are very interested in volunteer leadership. Many residencies are asking for leadership curricula, and some of them actually have them. And I think we're continuing to position our young members to participate and rise through to become leaders. So thank you again for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be back here, and I look forward to talking to more of you. Thank you.